I feel so lucky to be here because there are 4 people here who have really shifted my thinking because of things that they've written. Richard Dawkins from Unweaving the Rainbow was a very profound and important book for me. Darwin's Dangerous Idea by Daniel Dennett. That was the book that made me stop and say I'm an atheist. That was the book. And Christopher Hitchens' Missionary Position. It made me look at Mother Teresa differently. You know, like these people are coming at me from such different angles. I was always suspicious about her, but then I knew. But Sam Harrison's book, The End of Faith, really, you know, and when I read that book, I thought I was done with my shifts. I thought I had had all of the shifts I was going to have. And when I read The End of Faith, I realized that myself, thinking of myself as a liberal, modern, moderate person, even though I might have, suspicions about whether there was a God or not, was a completely untenable position to have, and that not only that, I and people like me were responsible, we were partly responsible for what was happening in the world. And in many ways, reading The End of Faith made me feel like I had to be an activist rather than keeping my opinions to myself. And I think of that book so often, and I've given it out to so many people, including my mother, who said, what is the one book that would help me understand what you're going through? Okay, The End of Faith, and I gave her The End of Faith, and then I saw it still on the bookshelf last time I was there this summer, and I thought she's never going to read that book. But for me, it really made a huge shift in the way I looked, because, you know, my world, I don't really run into fundamentalists. That's not part of my world. I live in Los Angeles. I cohort amongst what I consider to be relatively educated people. It's easy to hate the fundamentalists, but Sam, I feel, was the one who really enlightened a lot of people that they couldn't be educated people and not take a stand against religion as a whole. Like, it just wasn't okay anymore to approve of the idea of faith being a positive quality. I was thinking of it in 2 instances in the last 2 weeks. One is a good friend of mine who's also a mother of a child at the school that my daughter goes to, an educated person whose mother is a doctor, who was a doctor in World War II, but is a Methodist, and their family goes to a church for Sunday school. She said to me just this week on the playground, I found out that my mother doesn't believe in evolution. And of course I reject the idea of belief in evolution. I was thinking, it's accept the theory of evolution, but anyway. And I thought, well, that doesn't surprise me in the least. She's a Methodist, and you know, there's some cognitive dissonance in her mind that forces her not to be able to accept the theory of evolution. That doesn't surprise me. But my friend said, who I love very much, but she said, but that's such an uneducated position. That's so embarrassing to me. Lots of really smart people believe in God and evolution. Why can't she just believe in both of them? And I was standing on the playground thinking of Sam Harris. I wanted to hand her The End of Faith right there and say, I used to believe that too. And it was Sam Harris that made me realize that that was wrong. And that really, it's her position that's that's the hardest for me to understand. And I thank Sam so much for that book. And then, of course, as you know, he wrote Letter to a Christian Nation, which is fantastic. That's another little quick book, but rightly gets to the heart of things, and was a bestseller as well. And I couldn't be prouder to say that he's now a friend of mine. So, Sam Harris.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm very happy to be here, and I would like to thank Margaret, first of all, for organizing us and getting us here together. It's taken a tremendous amount of work on her part. I would also like to take a moment to just reflect on how strange it is that a meeting like this is even necessary. And the year is 2007, and we have all taken time out of our busy lives, and some of us have traveled considerable distance, to meet so that we can strategize about how best to live in a world where most people believe in an imaginary God. It seems astonishing that this is even necessary. America is now a nation of 300 million souls, wielding more influence than any people in human history, and yet this influence is being steadily corrupted and is surely waning because something like 240 million of these souls believe that Jesus is going to return and orchestrate the end of human history with his magic powers. Now, I think we may well wonder whether as many people believe these things as say they do. I know that Richard and certainly Christopher are quite more sanguine than I am about our opinion polls being out of register with what people believe in the privacy of their own minds. But it seems to me that our neighbors reliably profess these beliefs, and these professions have themselves done immense harm to our political discourse and to our public policy and to the teaching of science and to our stature in the world. And if even only a third or a quarter believe what most profess, I think it's a problem really worth worrying about. Now, in thinking what I could say to all of you tonight, it's not often that I'm in a room filled with people who are more or less guaranteed to agree with me on the subject of religion. And it seemed to me that in thinking what I have to say to you, I have a choice between throwing red meat to the lions of atheism or in moving the conversation into areas where we might not agree. So at some risk to your mood, I've decided to take the second path. And I think I might say some things that are controversial in this context. Given the absence of evidence for God, and given the stupidity and suffering that still thrives under the aegis of religion, atheism would seem to be the only sensible position to stake out. And it's a position that many of us have proudly and publicly adopted, perhaps all of us. I'd like to argue to you tonight that our use of this term atheism is a mistake. And it's a mistake of some consequence. My concerns over the use of the term atheism are both philosophical and strategic. I'm speaking, you should know, from a somewhat unusual position because I never thought of myself as an atheist before being inducted to speak as one. I never used the word in the End of Faith, which remains my most substantial criticism of religion. And as I argued in Letter to a Christian Nation, I think it is a word we fundamentally do not need, in the same way that we don't need a word for someone who rejects astrology. We simply are not tempted to call people non-astrologers. And if the comparison with astrology seems too facile to you, consider racism. Racism was about as intractable a social problem as we have ever had in this country. Now, I'm talking about deeply held convictions. I'm sure many of you, or probably all of you, have seen the photos of lynchings in the first half of the 20th century, where seemingly a whole town in the South, thousands of men, women, and children, lawyers, doctors, newspaper editors, church elders, even the occasional congressman and senator, would turn out as though for a carnival, simply to watch some young man or woman be tortured to death and then strung up on a tree or lamppost for all to see. And even if you've seen these pictures, realize that the pictures themselves are a poor indication of the horror of these episodes. Realize that these genteel people, who were otherwise quite normal, we must presume, though unfailingly religious, often took souvenirs of the body home to show their friends and family, teeth, ears, fingers, toes, and often displayed them in their places of business. Now, of course, I'm not saying racism is no longer a problem in this country, but anyone who thinks that the problem is undiminished has forgotten or has never learned how bad a problem it was. Now, my question to you is, so we've done something to racism. I mean, the KKK was battered to the fringes of society. We had a civil rights movement. We changed our discourse about race. Our major newspapers no longer write flagrantly racist editorials and articles as they did less than a century ago. But how many people have had to identify themselves as non-racists to participate in this process? Is there a non-racist alliance somewhere for me to join? It seems to me that attaching a label to something carries real liabilities especially when the thing you are naming isn't a thing at all. And I would argue to you that atheism is not a thing. It is not a philosophy, just as non-racism is not one. It is not a worldview, and yet it is regularly construed as one and attacked as such. And we who do not believe in God are collaborating in this misunderstanding by consenting to be named and by naming ourselves. Another problem with accepting a label is that we are consenting to be thought of as a marginal interest group. We're consenting to be thought of as a cranky subculture that meets in hotel ballrooms. Now, I'm not saying that meetings like this aren't important. I wouldn't be here if I didn't think it was important. But I am saying as a matter of philosophy, we are guilty of a confusion. And as a matter of strategy, I think we've walked into a trap. And it is a trap that, in many cases, I'm convinced, has been deliberately set for us. And we have jumped into it with both feet. Now, while it is an honor for me to find myself continually assailed, along with Dan and Richard and Christopher, as though we were a single person with 4 heads, I think this whole conversation about the new atheists and militant atheism has been used to keep our criticism of religion at arm's length, and has allowed people to reject our arguments without meeting the burden of actually answering them. And I think this whole discourse around the conflict between faith and reason and religion and science has been and will continue to be successfully marginalized under the banner of atheism. So let me make my somewhat seditious proposal explicit. We should not call ourselves atheists. We should not call ourselves secularists. We should not call ourselves secular humanists or freethinkers or rationalists or anti-theists or brights. We should not call ourselves anything. We should go under the radar for the rest of our lives. And while there, we should be decent, honest people who destroy bad ideas wherever we find them. Now, it just so happens that religion has more than its fair share of bad ideas. So I think, of necessity, we will continue to criticize religion. And religion, it must be recognized, is the only form of thinking in which bad ideas are held in perpetual immunity from criticism. And doing so is considered sacred. This is the act of faith. So I think, of necessity, we will be spending a lot of time talking about religion, but we should not name ourselves in opposition to religion. So what does all of this mean in practical terms, apart from Margaret having to change her letterhead? Well, rather than declare ourselves atheists, I think we should simply advocate intellectual honesty and reason. And where this advocacy brings us into collision with religion, as it inevitably will, we should notice that the points of collision are always with specific beliefs, and not with religion in general. There is no religion in general. And we should be quick, in fact, to point out the differences among religions, because these differences make all religions, for 2 reasons, these differences make all religions look contingent and therefore silly. I would consider the unique features of Mormonism, which may play some role in the next presidential election. Mormonism, it seems to me, objectively, is just a little bit more idiotic than Christianity is. It has to be. It is Christianity plus some very stupid ideas. For instance, the Mormons think that Jesus is going to return to earth and administer his 1,000 years of peace, at least part of the time from the state of Missouri. Now, why does this make Mormonism objectively less likely to be true than Christianity? Because whatever probability you assign to Jesus' coming back, you have to assign a lesser probability to his coming back and keeping a summer home in Jackson County, Missouri. Mitt Romney, if he wants to be the next president of the United States, should be made to feel the burden of our incredulity. We can make common cause with our Christian brothers and sisters on this point. Just what does the man believe? The world should know about it, and it is almost guaranteed to be embarrassing even to most people who believe in a biblical God. The second reason to be attentive to the differences among religions is that these differences are actually a matter of life and death. There are very few of us who lie awake at night worrying about the Amish. This is not an accident. While I'm convinced that the Amish are mistreating their children by not educating them adequately, they are not likely to hijack aircraft and fly them into buildings. Consider how we as atheists are constrained to talk about Islam. And Christians often complain that atheists balance, and the secular media generally, balance every discussion of Islam with a discussion of extremist Christianity. The usual mode is to say, well, they have their jihadists, but we have people who kill abortion doctors. Okay, I think our Christian neighbors, even the craziest of them, are right to be outraged by this pretense of even-handedness. The truth is that Islam is quite a bit scarier and more culpable for needless human misery at this moment than Christianity has been for a very, very long time. And we have to point this out. You might remember that Thomas Friedman recently wrote an op-ed from Iraq noticing that some Sunni militias were fighting alongside American troops against al-Qaeda, and he asked a Sunni militant why he was doing this. And the militant said that he had recently seen an al-Qaeda member decapitate an 8-year-old girl. And this convinced him that the American Crusader forces were the lesser of two evils. Now, okay, great. So even Muslims, even Sunni militants, can discern the line between ordinary crazy Islam and the utterly crazy once it is drawn in the spilled blood of little girls. This is a basis for hope of sorts. I mean, we have to be clear, unremittingly clear about what is on the other side of that line. I mean, this is what we and the rest of the civilized world and the semi-civilized world are facing. Utter religious lunacy and barbarism in the name of Islam with, I'm unhappy to say, some mainstream theology to back it up. To be even-handed, as we are constrained to be as atheists, when discussing the problem of Islam, is to misconstrue the problem. The refrain that all religions have their extremists is bullshit. All religions don't have these extremists. Some religions have never had these extremists. A recent poll in the UK showed that a third of young British Muslims say they want to live under Sharia law and think that anyone who leaves the faith should be put to death for apostasy. This is a third of British Muslims. 68% of British Muslims think that their neighbors who insult Islam should be arrested and prosecuted. 78% think that the Danish cartoonist should be brought to justice. These people do not have a clue about what constitutes a civil society. It seems to me that reports like this coming out of Muslim communities living in the West should concern us before anything else about religion concerns us. Atheism is too blunt an instrument to use at moments like this. It's as though we have a landscape of human bewilderment and human stupidity, and atheism causes us to fixate on one part of this landscape. It's got peaks and valleys and local attractors, and we fixate on one part, that related to a belief in God, and then it just flattens it. Because to be consistent as atheists, we must oppose or seem to oppose all faith claims equally. But this is a waste of precious time and energy. And it seems to me it squanders the trust of good people who would otherwise agree with us on specific issues. Now, I'm not at all suggesting that we leave people's core religious beliefs unscathed, or faith itself unscathed. I'm still the person who writes articles with rather sweeping titles like "Science Must Destroy Religion." But what I am saying is we have to be attentive to necessary and useful differences among religions. Another problem with calling ourselves atheists is that every religious person thinks he has a knockdown argument against atheism. We've all heard these arguments, and we are going to keep hearing them as long as we call ourselves atheists. We've all heard the argument that the atheist can't prove there is no God. Or as Rick Warren put it when I debated him for Newsweek, a rational person like him doesn't have enough faith to be an atheist. Because the idea that the universe could be created without a creator is the most extravagant faith claim of all. Now, as Richard just pointed out, these arguments are travesties if they're used to defend any specific conception of God. And we all know what to do in this situation. We have Russell's teapot, we have the thousands of dead gods, and now we have a flying spaghetti monster, the non-existence of which can't be proven, and yet the existence of which is a belief in which is acknowledged to be ridiculous by anyone. The problem is we have to keep having the same argument over and over again. So too with the greatest crimes of the 20th century argument. How many times are we going to have to counter the charge that Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot represent the end game of atheism? I got news for you. This meme is not going away. I argued against it in The End of Faith, and it was immediately thrown up at me in reviews of the book as though I had never mentioned it. So I mentioned it again in the afterword to the paperback of The End of Faith, and this did no good whatsoever. So then I brought it up again. At the risk of boring all of you, I brought it up again in Letter to a Christian Nation. And Richard did the same in The God Delusion. And Christopher took a mighty whack at it in God is Not Great. I think this argument will be with us for as long as we call ourselves atheists. And it really convinces people. It really convinces liberals and moderates. It even convinces the occasional atheist. Why should we stand obediently in the space provided? Why should we stand in the space carved out by the conceptual scheme of theistic religion? I mean, it's as though our opponents, before any debate, have drawn the chalk outline of a dead man on the sidewalk, and we just walk up and lie down in it. Instead of doing this, think about what would happen if we simply use words like reason and evidence. Now, what is the argument against reason? It's true that certain people will bite the bullet here and say that reason is itself a problem and the Enlightenment is a failed project, but the truth is very few people are comfortable admitting to being enemies of reason. Even among fundamentalists, I would say especially among fundamentalists. They imagine themselves to be champions of reason. They think they have very good reasons for believing in God. Nobody wants to believe things on bad evidence. The desire to know what is actually going on in the world is very difficult to argue with. And insofar as we represent merely that desire, we become difficult to argue with. And this desire is not reducible to an interest group. It's not a club, and it's not an affiliation. And I think trying to make it one, or giving the appearance that it is one, necessarily diminishes its power. Now, the last problem with atheism I'd like to talk about relates to some of the experiences that lie at the core of our religious traditions, and perhaps not all religions, but most, I would think. This experience is often referred to under the banner of things like spirituality and mysticism, and is described in what has come to be known as spiritual or mystical literature. Now, those of you who have read The End of Faith know that I don't entirely line up with Dan and Christopher and Richard in my discussion of these topics, so I think I should talk about this for a moment. While I always use words like spiritual and mystical in scare quotes, and I try to denude them of metaphysics, my email suggests that many of my brothers and sisters in arms find my interest in these topics problematic. So I want to go into this in a little bit of detail. First, let me just describe the general phenomenon I'm talking about. A person, in whatever culture he finds himself, one day notices that life is difficult. He notices that in the best of times, even in the best of times, no one close to him has died. There are no hostile armies massing in the distance. The fridge is stocked with beer, and the weather is just so. Even when things are going as well as they can go, he notices that at the level of his attention, moment to moment, he is seeking happiness and only finding temporary relief from his search. And we've all noticed this, and we seek pleasant sights and sounds and tastes and sensations and attitudes. We become connoisseurs of art and music and literature. But our pleasures are, by their very nature, fleeting. I mean, the best we can do is merely reiterate them as often as we are able. If we enjoy some great professional success, this remains vivid and intoxicating to us for about an hour, maybe a day. But then people begin to ask you, well, what are you going to do next? You know, don't you have something in the pipeline? Steve Jobs releases the iPhone. I'm sure it wasn't 20 minutes before someone came up to him and said, when are you going to make this thing smaller? Now, notice at this juncture, very few people say, oh, I'm done. I've met all my goals. And now I'm just going to stay here and eat ice cream until I die in front of you. Even when things have gone as well as they can go, the search for happiness, the effort required to keep boredom and dissatisfaction and doubt at bay continues. At the very least, death and the loss of loved ones interrupts regularly even the most well-ordered and gratifying life. So in this context, many people have begun to wonder whether or not a different form of well-being, a deeper form of well-being exists, a form of well-being that is not contingent upon merely reiterating one's pleasures and avoiding one's pains. Is there a form of happiness that is not contingent upon always having one's favorite food available to be placed on one's tongue, or having one's friends and family within arm's reach, or having good books to read, or having something to look forward to on the weekend? Is it possible to be happy before anything happens, before one's desires get gratified, in the very midst of life's vicissitudes, in the very midst of old age, disease, and death? Now, I think this question lies at the periphery of everyone's consciousness. But we are all, in some sense, living our answer to this question. And many of us are living as though the answer is no. No, there is nothing more profound than seeking satisfaction, moment to moment. There's nothing more profound than reiterating your pleasures, sensory, emotional, intellectual. So many of us are living as though there's nothing to do but just keep our foot on the gas until we run out of road. But certain people, for whatever reason, wonder whether or not there's another strategy to be adopted than this. And many of them are led to wonder this by religion, by the example of people like the Buddha and Jesus and the literature that has grown up around these figures. And these people begin to practice various techniques of introspection, often called meditation or contemplation, as a means of training their attention on their moment-to-moment experience to see if there is a deeper basis of well-being to be discovered at all. They might even go into a cave for months or years at a time, or an ashram or some other secluded spot. Why would a person do this? Well, it's actually a very simple experiment. I mean, here's the logic of it. If there is a form of happiness to be found that is not contingent upon merely reiterating your pleasures, then it should be available in a circumstance where all obvious sources of pleasure have been removed. It should be available to someone who has gone to some secluded spot in the desert or in a cave, who has declined to marry her high school sweetheart, who has renounced all of her material possessions. It should be available in a context that would on its face be deeply uncongenial to the satisfaction of ordinary desire and ordinary aspiration. Now, one clue as to how daunting most of us and most people would find such a project is that solitary confinement, which is essentially what we're talking about, is considered a punishment even inside a prison. I mean, even when confined with homicidal maniacs and rapists, most people still prefer the company of others to the prospects of being alone in a box for a significant stretch of time. And yet contemplatives for millennia claim to have found extraordinary depths of psychological well-being in circumstances very much like solitary confinement. Now, it seems to me, as rational people, whether we call ourselves atheists or not, we have a choice to make in how we view this whole enterprise. I mean, either the contemplative literature is a mere catalog of psychopathology and deliberate fraud and religious delusion, or people have been having interesting and sometimes normative experiences under the banner of mysticism and spirituality. Now, let me just assert on the basis of my own study and experience that I have no doubt that certain people have improved their self-understanding and their ethical intuitions, and even made genuine discoveries about the nature of subjectivity itself through traditional practices like meditation. I mean, leaving aside all the metaphysics and mythology and mumbo-jumbo, what contemplatives and mystics over the ages claim to have found is that there is an alternative to living at the mercy of the next neurotic thought that comes careening into consciousness. There's an alternative to being continuously spellbound by this conversation we are having with ourselves. And most of us think that if a person is walking down the street talking to himself, that is not able to censor himself in front of other people, he's probably mentally ill. But if we talk to ourselves all day long, silently, thinking, rehearsing prior conversations, thinking about what we should have said, we could have said, we might yet say, we just know enough to keep this silent, then this is perfectly normal. This is perfectly compatible with basic human sanity. Well, the experiences of contemplatives over the millennia suggest that this is not so, that there's another way of looking at this phenomenon. Now, of course, I'm by no means denying the importance of thought. I think thought is obviously indispensable for us. It's the basis of most culture. It's certainly the basis of all science. It's the basis of all of our social relationships. And linguistic thought is surely responsible for much rudimentary cognition. I mean, it's responsible for our ability to integrate planning and explicit learning and moral reasoning in many cases. I mean, even talking to oneself out loud might serve a function occasionally. But from the point of view of our contemplative traditions, and this is to reduce them all down to a cartoon version that ignores the rather esoteric disputes between them, our habitual failure to recognize thought as thought, our habitual identification with discursive thought is a primary source of human suffering. And when a person breaks this spell, an extraordinary kind of relief is available. Now, the problem with a contemplative claim of this sort is that you can't borrow someone else's contemplative tools to test it. You have to develop your own tools. I mean, imagine if the science of astronomy, if you couldn't even observe whether there was a phenomenon worth looking at unless you built your own telescope. Okay, this would be an immense barrier to establishing astronomy as a science. It wouldn't make the sky any less worthy of our investigation, but it would be an immense impediment. To judge the claims of contemplatives, we have to build our own telescope. Judging their metaphysical claims and their philosophical claims, we can use thought itself. Many of these can be dismissed as bad science or bad philosophy on their merits. But to judge whether certain experiences are possible, and if possible, desirable, we have to be able to use our attention in the requisite ways, if only for a few moments. Now, one problem with atheism, it seems to me, as a category of thought, is that it is almost synonymous with not being interested in such phenomenon. It's almost synonymous with not being interested with what the Buddha or Jesus may have experienced in his life. And it seems to me that many atheists, though perhaps not all, reject such experiences out of hand as being either undesirable or impossible. Now, another common mistake is to imagine that whatever experiences these contemplatives have had, they're identical to experiences we're all familiar with. They're identical to scientific awe or aesthetic appreciation or artistic inspiration. Now, let me just say, as someone who has made his own modest efforts in this area, when someone goes into solitude for months or years at a time and trains himself in meditation for 15 to 18 hours a day, doing nothing but observe the contents of his own consciousness and try not to be lost in thought, not reading, not writing, not talking, just making a moment-to-moment effort to pay undivided attention to the arising of thought and to the arising of sensory experience. He experiences things that most scientists and artists are not familiar with unless they've made the identical introspective efforts. And these experiences have something to say about the plasticity of human experience itself and the possibilities of human happiness. So apart from just commending these phenomena to your attention, I want to say that our neglect of these phenomena as atheists puts us at a rhetorical disadvantage, because millions of people have had these experiences, and many millions more have had glimmers of them. And these experiences are often the most important and transformative moments in their lives. And if we, by definition, ignore them because of their entanglement with religion, we appear less wise than even our craziest religious opponents. Now, I don't know if the universe is, as J.B.S. Haldane said, not only stranger than we suppose, but stranger than we can suppose. But I'm pretty sure that it is stranger than we as atheists tend to represent while advocating atheism. I mean, as atheists, we tend to give people a sense, and even give ourselves a sense, that we are well on our way to purging the universe of mystery. As advocates of reason, we know that mystery is going to be with us for quite some time. In fact, there are good reasons to believe that mystery may be ineradicable from our circumstance. I mean, because however much we understand the universe, it seems like there could well always be brute facts which we can't explain, but which we must use to explain everything else. Now, this is not a problem for human life. It is not a barrier to human happiness. But we are faced with the task of convincing a myth-infatuated world that love and curiosity are sufficient, and that you don't have to delude yourself and frighten yourself with Iron Age fairy tales. This is a monumental task. I don't think there's any intellectual struggle more worthy of our efforts. But it seems to me that we should not, in this effort, fight in well-ordered ranks like the redcoats of atheism. I think it's worth thinking about what victory will look like. And again, the example of racism seems instructive to me. What will it look like when we finally conquer the evil of racism, should that happy day ever dawn? It's certainly not going to be a world in which a majority of people profess themselves to be non-racist. It will very likely be a world in which the very concept of separate races has lost its meaning. I think if we win this war of ideas with religion, we will find ourselves in a world in which the concept of atheism is scarcely intelligible. It will be a concept like non-astrology. Now, I think this is a future absolutely worth fighting for. I think it may, in fact, be the only future compatible with our survival as a species. I mean, this will be a world simply where people cease to praise one another for believing things or pretending to believe things for which they have no evidence. But the only path between now and then that I can see is for us to be unremittingly honest and to advocate intellectual honesty. And it seems to me that intellectual honesty will always be more durable and deeper and more easily spread than atheism. Thank you very much.